achieved a law degree in 1891. Lenin, who was a Marxist, moved to Petrograd, Russia. Marx believed in an international revolution of the poor and middle-class workers called the proletariat, who would lead way for a new system of power. Under this new system, Marx argued property would be owned communally and work would be distributed equally. He wrote controversial papers and articles and tried to organize workers. The St. Petersburg Union for the Struggle for the Liberation of Labor, which Lenin helped create, was one of the seeds that started the Russian Marxist movement. In 1897, Lenin was arrested, spent some months in jail, and was finally sentenced to 3 years of exile in the remote area of Siberia. He was there joined by a fellow Marxist, Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya, whom he married in 1898. During his Siberian exile, he produced a major study of the Russian economy and called it The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Not long after, Lenin was released from Siberia in the summer of 1900 and moved to Europe. He spent most of the next 17 years there, moving from one country to another, frequently writing editorials and making revolutionary contacts, and trying to gain funds for his own revolutionary activities in Russia. During Lenin's time in exile, a Marxist movement had developed in Russia. It was a response to the rapid growth of industry, cities, and the proletariat. By 1902, Lenin had expressed these ideas in an important book, What is to be Done. When the leaders of the Russian Marxists gathered for their first important party meeting in 1903, their ideas clashed. These disagreements over the nature and organization of the party led to the split of Russian Marxism into two factions. The one led by Lenin called itself the majority faction, or the Bolsheviks, while the other took the name of minority faction, the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks and Mensheviks disagreed not only on how to organize the movement, but also over most other political problems. In 1905, widespread revolt against the Russian Tsar's government spread throughout the country, but was eventually put to an end by the government. This revolt among the Russian people surprised all of the Russian revolutionary leaders, including the Bolsheviks. Lenin managed to return to Russia only in November, when the defeat of the revolution was practically certain. But he was among the last to give up, and for many more months he urged his followers to renew their revolutionary eagerness and activities and to prepare for an armed uprising, which never came. Over the next 12 years, Bolshevism, which had begun as a faction within the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, gradually emerged as an independent party that had severed its ties with all other Russian Marxists. The process involved long and bitter arguments about funds and struggles for control of newspaper against the Mensheviks. Disputes concerned many questions about the goals and strategies of Marxism and the role of national struggles rather than the problems within Marxism. Since 1905, the international socialist movement had also begun to discuss the possibility of a major war breaking out among European nations. In 1907 and 1912, members met and condemned such wars in advance, pledging not to support them. Lenin had wanted to go further than that. He had urged active opposition to the war effort and transformation of any war into a proletarian revolution. When World War I broke out, most socialist leaders in the countries involved supported the war effort. For Lenin, this was proof that he and the other leaders shared no common aims or views. The break between the two schools of Marxism could not be fixed. During World War I, Lenin lived in Switzerland. He attended several conferences of the radical socialists opposed to the war. He read large amounts of literature on the Marxist idea of state government and world politics. He then wrote a first draft for a book, The State and Revolution, and then he wrote a second book, Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, in 1916. By the beginning of 1917, he had fits of depression and wrote to a close friend that he thought he would never see another revolution. This was about a month before the overthrow of the Russian Tsar, in the winter of 1917, which marked the beginning of the 1917 Russian Revolution. Lenin's first major obstacle was how to return to Russia. For Lenin and a few of his fellow revolutionaries, the return through the enemy country of Germany was one that would require a great deal of valor. reversed many of his policies and instituted a reform called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. The New Economic Policy was a way to delay moving immediately into a socialist economy. Instead,